There is a stretch of the Nile, roughly 1,000 miles south of Cairo, where the river bends through desert that most people never picture when they think about ancient Africa. The sand is darker there. The rock is harder, and buried beneath that landscape are the ruins of a civilization that once did something no one in the ancient world thought possible. It conquered Egypt, not raided it, not harassed its borders, conquered it, sat on its throne, wore its crowns, ruled its temples and its priests and its scribes for nearly a century. And then, when the dust of that century finally settled, the civilization that had been conquered turned around and did something almost more remarkable than the conquest itself. It tried to delete the conquerors from memory. Their names were chiseled off walls. Their statues were smashed and buried in pits. Their monuments were quarried for stone. Their language, their gods, their kings, their queens, all of it was pushed south of the border and then pushed further into a silence that lasted more than 2,000 years. For a long time, the assumption inside Egyptology was that this silence meant the Southern Kingdom had never really mattered, that it was a rough imitation of Egypt. A frontier culture, a sideshow. The pyramids scattered across the Sudanese desert were cataloged as curiosities, smaller and steeper than their northern cousins, and the story, more or less, ended there. That assumption held for over a century. Recent excavations in northern Sudan have taken that assumption apart piece by piece, and the picture that has emerged from the sand of Meroe, from the royal cemeteries at El Kuru and Nuri, from the temple complexes at Jebel Barkal, and from a set of inscriptions that scholars are only now beginning to fully translate, is not the picture Egyptology inherited. Kush was not a shadow of Egypt. For a critical stretch of the ancient world, Kush was the power that Egypt tried and failed and then tried again to erase. This is the story of how that erasure worked, why it happened, and what the ground has finally started to say back. Before we go further, if the shape of ancient Africa beyond the pyramids at Giza is something you want to keep seeing on this channel, subscribing genuinely helps the work continue. That is the entire ask. Now the desert. The kingdom we call Kush emerged in the region the Egyptians called Taseti, the land of the bow, along the Nile south of the First Cataract. By roughly 2500 BCE, cities were rising there. By 1700 BCE, one of those cities, Kerma, had grown into something that made the Egyptians distinctly uncomfortable. Kerma had walls of mud brick thicker than the walls of most contemporary Egyptian towns. It had a royal quarter, workshops producing glazed ceramics of a quality that competed directly with Egyptian output, and burial mounds so large they can still be seen from satellite imagery. For a long time, the standard reading of Kerma was that it was a wealthy trading post that had picked up the trappings of civilization from its northern neighbor. The logic seemed sound. Egypt was older, more literate, better documented, and geographically upstream of most of the surviving written record. So, Kerma must have learned from Egypt. It was the reasonable default. The excavations at Kerma have made that default very difficult to hold. The site's monumental architecture, particularly the great mud brick structure known as the Western Tefufa, predates the peak period of Egyptian influence in the region. The metallurgy at Kerma shows techniques that appear earlier in the archaeological sequence than parallel Egyptian examples. And the burial practices enormous tumuli, containing not just the king but hundreds of sacrificed retainers arranged in careful rows, have no direct Egyptian antecedent at all. Radiocarbon dating on organic material from the largest of these tumuli returned results that placed the burial in the 17th century BCE, contemporary with a period when Egypt itself was fragmented and weak under the pressure of the Hyksos invasions from the north. That is the pivot. Kerma was not learning at Egypt's feet. Kerma was rising while Egypt was falling, and for a stretch of roughly 100 years, the Kushite state at Kerma was arguably the dominant power on the Nile. When Egypt eventually reunified under the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, one of the first things it did was march south. Thutmose I pushed the border past the Fourth Cataract. His successors built fortresses. Temples were erected at Sudanese sites bearing Egyptian names and Egyptian gods. The official Egyptian record described this as bringing civilization to a wretched land. The archaeology tells a different story about what was actually happening on the ground. At sites like Sai Island and Sesebe, excavations have uncovered layers where Egyptian and Kushite material culture do not sit in separate zones but interpenetrate. Egyptian officials were buried with Kushite grave goods. Kushite elites adopted Egyptian titles but retained their own naming conventions. The picture is not one of a conqueror imposing culture on a blank population. It is one of a long, uneasy fusion in which the southern population absorbed what suited it and quietly discarded the rest. And then, around 1070 BCE, the Egyptian empire collapsed inward on itself. For roughly 300 years afterward, Egypt fractured into competing dynasties, foreign rulers, and internal disputes that the surviving papyri only half explain. The archaeological record in Nubia during this stretch is thin, which for a long time was read as evidence that the south had also collapsed, presumably because it depended on Egyptian administration. Excavations at El Kuru, the royal cemetery of the emerging Kushite dynasty, have rewritten that reading. The tombs at El Kuru begin as modest tumuli in the local Nubian tradition. And then, generation by generation, they grow. They become larger. They acquire chapels. They acquire pyramids. Not the great sloping pyramids of Giza, but steeper, narrower structures, more reminiscent of the private tombs of the Egyptian New Kingdom elite. The grave goods inside them are wealthy gold, faience, imported bronzes, and the names on the funerary stelae belong to kings whose successors would, within a few generations, march north. The man who eventually made that march was named Pi. Around 730 BCE, Pi led a Kushite army down the Nile, defeated the coalition of Egyptian rulers who tried to stop him at Heracleopolis, took the city of Memphis, and had himself crowned as pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. His victory, steal a slab of granite nearly 6 feet tall, discovered at Jebel Barkal in 1862, is one of the longest royal inscriptions to survive from the ancient Nile. And here is the detail that historians spent a long time not knowing what to do with. Pi was pious, deeply, publicly, ostentatiously pious. His stele describes him halting his campaign to celebrate religious festivals. It describes him refusing to enter the presence of defeated rulers who had not properly purified themselves. It describes him treating captured horses with more visible outrage over their mistreatment than he directed at the humans who had mistreated them. The initial scholarly instinct was to treat this as propaganda, a Kushite king trying to out-Egyptian the Egyptians, performing piety to justify his rule. Recent rereadings of the stele, informed by comparative work on Kushite religious inscriptions from Jebel Barkal itself, have complicated that reading considerably. Pi's religious framework is not a copy of contemporary Egyptian practice. It is a distinct tradition, centered on the god Amun in his specifically Kushite form, with its own priesthood, its own rituals, and its own theological claims about the legitimacy of kingship. When Pi entered Egypt, he did not enter as a foreigner adopting local gods. He entered as a devotee of a shared god who believed, sincerely and provably from the archaeological evidence, that the Kushite version of that worship was the older, purer form. He was not imitating Egypt. In his own frame, he was correcting it. Pi's successors, his brother Shabaka, his nephew Taharka, and the kings who came after ruled Egypt for close to a century. This is the period Egyptologists label the 25th dynasty. Under Taharka in particular, the ambition of the Kushite pharaohs became extraordinary. He built more monuments across the Nile Valley than almost any single ruler before him. He commissioned temples in both Egypt and Sudan simultaneously. His inscriptions mention diplomatic contact with the Levant, and there is a reference to a Kushite king in the Hebrew Bible 2 Kings, chapter 19, that most scholars now identify with him. And then came Assyria. The Assyrian Empire under Esarhaddon and then Ashurbanipal invaded Egypt in the 670s and 660s BCE with an army built around iron weapons, siege equipment, and a level of logistical organization the Kushites could not match. Taharqa fought them. His successor, Tantamani, fought them. Both were eventually driven south, back across the cataracts, back into the heartland that had produced them. The 25th dynasty ended in retreat, not extinction. The Kushite state survived. It moved its capital further south, to Meroe, and continued as an independent kingdom for nearly another 1,000 years. But in Egypt itself, something began to happen that the archaeology has only recently made explicit. At the Temple of Karnak, at Medinet Habu, at sites across Upper Egypt where Kushite pharaohs had left inscriptions and reliefs, the names of the 25th dynasty rulers began to be chiseled out. Their faces on temple walls were defaced. Statues of Taharqa were toppled and, in some cases, deliberately buried in pits, not lost, buried, which is a different act with different implications. At Karnak's Kashet, discovered in 1903, over 700 statues were found in a single deposit, and a significant portion of the Kushite royal sculpture from that period was among them. This is the pattern that made the older historical narrative reasonable. Erased names, buried statues, successor dynasties, particularly the 26th under Psamtik I, systematically dismantling the visible legacy of Kushite rule. If you took the surviving Egyptian record at face value, the Kushites had barely been there, a brief intrusion, a footnote. An MRI of the Karnak Kashet assemblage, meaning a full three-dimensional survey of the statues, their damage patterns, and their burial context, published in stages over the last 15 years, removed the ambiguity. The damage to the Kushite pieces was not random. It was not the result of later reuse or accidental breakage. It was targeted. The faces were struck. The royal cartouches were chiseled out. The statues were then interred with a care that suggests the people doing the burying knew perfectly well who these kings had been and wanted their memory contained rather than destroyed. You do not carefully bury what does not matter. This is where the question sharpens. Why go to the trouble? If Kush had been the minor frontier culture the older narrative described, the effort would make no sense. You erase, ritually and expensively, what you cannot afford to be remembered. The self-critical reading here is important. It is possible that the damnatio memoriae directed at the 25th dynasty was simply the standard practice of Egyptian successor kings toward predecessors they wished to delegitimize, and that reading Kushite specificity into it overstates the case. Psamtik I did similar things to other rivals. Political erasure was a routine tool, but the scale is different. The number of pieces, the consistency across geographically separated sites, the parallel absence of Kushite material culture from later Egyptian art at moments when Nubian themes had been common for centuries before. What was done to the 25th dynasty was done with more thoroughness than what was done to comparable internal rivals. And what was done to Kush itself, in the historical memory of the Mediterranean world afterward, tracks that thoroughness. Greek and Roman authors writing about Egypt inherited a version of the story in which the southern kingdom was distant, exotic, and largely irrelevant. Herodotus mentions Ethiopia, by which he meant broadly the region of Kush. But his account is brief and mostly mythological. Strabo is dismissive. The detailed record of a civilization that had produced pharaohs, waged wars against Assyria, and built pyramids of its own was already fading by the time classical writers picked up the story. Meanwhile, in Sudan, Kush kept going. The kingdom at Meroe developed its own script, Meroitic, which remains only partially deciphered even today. It built the largest concentration of pyramids in the ancient world, over 200 of them, more than exist in all of Egypt combined. It maintained iron-working industries whose slag heaps still dominate the archaeological landscape around the ancient city. It traded with Rome, fought Rome, and negotiated a border treaty with Rome that held for nearly 3 centuries. And none of that, until recently, was central to how most people outside a specialist field understood ancient African history. The excavations of the last 2 decades have started to shift that. Work at Meroe, led by joint Sudanese, European, and American teams, has expanded the known extent of the royal city. Survey work in the deserts east of the Nile has documented Kushite outposts far beyond the boundaries that older maps assign to the kingdom. The tombs at Nuri, including the massive pyramid of Taharqa himself, have been re-entered by divers working in flooded burial chambers. The water table has risen since antiquity, and the material recovered has begun to fill in details of royal burial practice that texts alone could never provide. There is a broader point that the ground has been making, quietly, for a while now. The people who built Kerma 4,000 years ago, who founded the 25th dynasty, who ruled Meroe for a millennium, they were not neurologically or cognitively distinct from any human being alive today. That much has been true of every civilization discussed on this channel. Their capacity for planning, for religious speculation, for political strategy, for engineering, was the human capacity that has been available for tens of thousands of years. What differs across civilizations is not the equipment, it is the specific choices made with it. Kush chose to build steep pyramids over hundreds of them. It chose to develop its own script. It chose, in PA's moment, to march north and rewrite what pharaonic legitimacy could look like. Those choices were not lesser choices than the choices made at Thebes or Memphis. They were different choices, made by people with the same brains, operating in different conditions, pursuing different priorities. The erasure did not happen because Kush was minor. The erasure happened because Kush was not. A century of foreign rule at the top of the pharaonic system was, for the Egyptian successor dynasties, a wound. The chiseling and the burial and the careful forgetting were the work of people who understood exactly what had happened to them and did not want their descendants to be able to picture it too clearly. And there is a harder edge to the story that recent scholarship has not shied away from. The Kushite state, particularly at Kerma, practiced human sacrifice on a scale that few contemporary civilizations approached. The retainer burials in the great tumuli included hundreds of individuals, women and children among them, and the physical evidence indicates that at least some were interred alive. The 25th dynasty, for all PA's celebrated piety, waged wars whose captives ended up in conditions the inscriptions do not describe kindly. The empire at Meroe traded in enslaved people across a network that reached deep into the African interior. A civilization that produced its own script, its own theology, and its own pyramids also produced practices that a modern reader cannot look at without discomfort. Neither fact cancels the other. The kingdom was expansive, literate, and sophisticated. It was also, in specific practices, brutal. The archaeology records both without asking us to choose. What the archaeology does ask us to do is stop treating the silence in the Egyptian record as evidence of Kushite unimportance. The silence is evidence of something else. It is evidence that a successor culture worked hard and expensively to produce it. There is one last detail worth sitting with. The pyramids at Meroe, the ones that outnumber Egypt's, the ones scattered across the Sudanese desert in fields that stretch for miles, were largely intact into the 19th century. The damage they show today is not the damage of 3,000 years. It is the damage of the 1830s, when an Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini demolished the tops of over 40 of them looking for gold. He found some, and then he moved on, leaving behind decapitated monuments that had survived every previous empire that had passed through. The erasure of Kush, in other words, did not end with the 26th dynasty. It continued, in different forms, for a very long time. What the last 20 years of excavation have started to do is reverse it. Piece by piece, steel by steel, buried statue by buried statue, the kingdom is coming back into focus, not as a shadow of Egypt, not as a footnote, as something the ancient world produced on its own terms, and something the modern world is only now, finally, learning how to see. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the channel is here for it. The desert has more to say.